Okay, welcome back to the third and final part of our presentations on the launch of part 2 of the Ancholme Valley project. And this is part of our Together for Our Planet project on climate change, supported by the National Lottery. So I want to look at some of the issues. What are the implications of climate change? Then maybe some of the things that we can start to set in train to change things for the better, to increase resilience, to increase adaptation. Because with climate change, you're trying to decrease the extent of climate change that we don't want, so reducing the actual scale of climate change, so stopping things that are clearly making it worse, but also we need to be able to make the landscape and our lives more resilient in the face of the changes and the challenges that are about to come. So we're going to share screen here, and there we are. So facing climate challenges in the Ancholme Valley, and this is part 3, the final of the 3 presentations on this theme. So what are the impacts? Well, the impacts in some parts of the planet are absolutely obvious and apparent. Ice sheets collapsing, glaciers retreating, animals that have relied on these sort of environments increasingly under pressure. And this is a mixture of not just greenhouse gas release, but it's also the fact that we allow, for example, soils to wash off from our farmland. If you take a view of anywhere over, say, the British Isles, if you take a satellite image, you can see the impact of topsoil washing off all the great rivers and into the seas and then into the oceans and causing pollution there. So it's a double whammy. We're losing our future landscape, our farming landscape, which as a farmer is, your soil is everything, and we seem to allow it to degrade and to erode and blow and wash away almost without second thought. It is absolutely crazy. And yet at the same time, it's a double whammy because it's affecting the fisheries of the seas and the oceans and the biodiversity there as well. So this is really a dire situation. What we've ended up with is what I call a dysfunctional ecology. We've got a breakdown of food chains and food webs and seasonal cycles and interdependencies. We have increasingly regular issues of pests and diseases. Even COVID and things like these are invasive diseases spreading around the planet because we have dysfunctional ecological systems. We've broken our connection to nature. There are issues of distribution and abundance of species, of invasive species and extinctions, of crops and our ability to grow crops or not to grow crops and what they require. So the ecological systems are falling apart. The pollinators are disappearing. And we have non-native species coming in, although I quite like the ringneck parakeets. But it is a sign of this Disneyfication, this globalization of our ecological systems and the decrease in regional and national distinctiveness and the sustainability and the functionality of those systems. And into this mix, we get extreme weather and the consequences of extreme weather. So we get flood and drought. They are flip sides of the same coin. When you get flood, the water is rushing off. It's carrying your topsoil away. It's carrying pollutants in that topsoil into the rivers, into the estuaries, into the seas. And then because the water is rushed away rather than percolating into the land, into the groundwater, being held in the landscape, in the marshes and fens and bogs, then you get drought because the water has gone. So it's like the buses when you get 3 buses at once. With the flooding, you get all the water at once, and then you get nothing, a drought. And we get storms, and the storms are increasing by orders of magnitude. So worth thinking about what the implications of these are and the damage that that does to infrastructure, to homes, to people. And extreme heat. which we've witnessed particularly this last year. Absolutely extraordinary scenes where, combined with extreme heat and drought, we've had wildfires that have swept through the landscape and burnt to the ground people's homes in Britain. This is something that we are not used to. But also, it's not just one way. You get extreme cold. So you get extreme heat on the one hand, and then you may move into extreme cold weather on the other, depending on things like the jet streams in the upper atmosphere during the winter period. And linked to all these, as I say, associated problems of soil degradation and erosion. And of course, linked to soil degradation and erosion, not only do we have scenes like this, but we also have big issues and questions about the long-term food security. Where are we going to get our food in the future? And particularly if other countries around the world no longer wish to export their own food because they have no food surplus. These are difficult questions that we seem at present not to be looking at in the longer term. And the scale of some of these impacts is absolutely frightening and catastrophic. There are also social and humanitarian issues associated with these changes. And climate change is likely to increase social and economic imbalance and associated unrest in individual countries, but also around the world and between the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. There's globally significant displacement of communities. And we see this now. We see breakdown of law and order. We see civil unrest in areas across Africa, areas around the Caucasus, areas across into Asia, and the displacement of communities and people desperate. And then they're viewed as uninvited aliens when they come to the more affluent, developed Western nations. There are massive economic implications of all these things that I'm saying. And you have to kind of look at what's happening across the planet. I think, well, my God, what do we do? How are we going to address these things? And the global imbalance. You know, the standard of living, the awful lack of hygiene, lack of sanitation, lack of food, lack of anything. So what do we do? And what are we prepared to do? What are we doing? Are we taking it seriously or not? So the big, big issues of climate justice and human justice that we need to think about. The economic and development issues are massive. The situation is huge. The challenges are huge. And also the challenges are unpredictable, from extreme weather impacts to food supply, water supply, disease, displacement, damage to infrastructure, health costs, etc. And yet at the same time, there are opportunities. And we need to think about the opportunities in order to trigger adaptation and mitigation. Now I speak as a Sheffield United, but this is one of the things with landscape. There, the Sheffield Wednesday ground used as very effective off-channel storage of floodwater. We need to think more creatively. My apologies to any Wednesday fans. We need to think about how we capture energy. Are we serious about dealing with these issues? At the moment, because of climate crisis on the one hand, but also because of political crisis in Europe on the other, energy prices are going through the roof. And it galls me to see farmland covered with solar panels. And we need to think about the types of solar panels that we're using and working with businesses that are biodiversity friendly and community friendly when we do this. And perhaps more clever landscape screening to make these features more acceptable in the landscape, and maybe using the grass that remains and wildflower meadows for pollinators. The things that we can do, which are really quite remarkable, and not just industrializing the rural landscape. But why are we not building and insisting on these panels on every distribution centre, every warehouse, every business premises along the motorway corridors and the other industrial areas. Those businesses are contributing nothing to mitigating flooding. They're causing flooding because they're often built on floodplain. But why are there not batteries of solar panels on every rooftop? Why are there not wind turbines on every rooftop? Why are there no biodiversity offsets and features, pocket parks and green walls and other wildlife-friendly features? And surely all these things I'm talking about could be manufactured in local businesses within those motorway corridor areas, like in Doncaster, for example, with the M18, or Scunthorpe with the M180. Why are we not doing that? So why is then the servicing of these facilities not employing local people? If we are serious about dealing with the challenges, we need to actually step up, and that is everybody. And the people that have the money in these situations are often those big businesses. And it's now in their interests as well to engage in this way. But I don't see it. I don't see us taking it seriously. We need to think about regional local responses. That's the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission, for example, have net zero targets. They have targets for resilience and a just transition to new situations and nature recovery. These are all wonderful aspirations, but they need to be much more all-encompassing. They need to engage a much wider audience. There are 30 commissioners plus meetings and panels. They have research and development. They have future economy moving to net zero. They have policy drivers. There are issues of land, water, nature, and food. These are all the things I've been talking about in the last 3 presentations about land use, economy, community, nature recovery. There are expected and predicted scenarios, but that is all they are. They are, intelligent guesswork as to what's going to happen. We think warmer temperatures. Bear in mind that if the Gulf Stream shifts a long way south, then we could actually end up much, much colder. We could end up with a similar climate to Moscow in winter, minus 30 degrees. So think about that. Drier summers, wetter winters, heavier rainfall during storms. So more extreme events, and the more extreme events more frequently. Increased flooding, species changes, new pests and diseases. This is all part of the same thing. So what are the outcomes? Increased uncertainty and risks to people and nature. We will be living in a much changed world. We already are. So mitigation and adaptation, tackling causes, reducing emissions, capturing carbon, dealing with effects. And some of these things we know. The evidence is there. We are aware of them. We are simply not doing them. And when I talk to farmers and landowners, one of the issues is, we can slow the flow for floodwater. We can capture carbon with different land use. We can do all these things. We can enhance biodiversity. We can make food production much more sustainable in the long term. You can reduce inputs, fertilizer and energy. But with clever farming systems, you actually don't reduce your outputs as much. So you make more money for less effort. That's a win-win. But a big issue is that the processes, the bureaucracy which we get to make these things happen is unbelievable. It needs to be easy. It needs to be quick. It needs to be effective. And it's not. It's bureaucratic, it's heavy-handed, and it's often taken with a negative overview. So we need to deal with the effects. We need to look at growing resilience, accommodating changes, accepting transformation. Some of these things are going to happen, and we need to learn to live with them and to adapt. So what about local responses and actions? We need to think global and act local. We've been talking about this since the 1980s, 1990s. Are we doing it? I don't know. On the one hand, things are happening. On the other hand, you suddenly find that planning systems allow anything, anywhere, anytime for anyone, without thought of communities, without thought of local control, without thought of local adaptation, without a real feel for what the implications are going to be. Politicians often think very short term, and that's not going to solve the problems. Community action is the core of what we need. Now, the Ancholme is a really exciting example of this because it was described to me in the early days of our interest here as one of the best rewilding opportunities in lowland England. Drained through the 1600s land improvement, the project addresses climate change, sea level rise, regional socioeconomics, supported by local stakeholders to reverse negative socioeconomic trends and to be more resilient to environmental changes, dealing with things like heritage, biodiversity and landscape. From the regional growth goal for nature-based tourism, for example. Yeah, we can actually implement some of the suggestions that we've had, and we've talked to lots of landowners and farmers, and people are very, very excited and very positive. But to keep a vibrant farming community, a vibrant farming landscape, but also to develop a regional growth goal for nature-based tourism and other economic benefits. There are things that we can do which are very positive, and it is possible to do them here in the Ancholme very, very effectively. And not only that, the Ancholme can then be a showcase for these sort of ideas. So one of the things of the project so far has been to try and grow skills and enthusiasm. And it's great that when we started, the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, for example, reconvened regional stakeholder networks and strategic meetings with partners like the Environment Agency and Natural England and others to do some of the things that we're talking about. So that is really good to see that happening. But it needs to happen on the ground. It needs to happen with local stakeholders, communities, parishes, town councils, educational groups. Everybody needs to be involved. And those people who are involved need to be the ones who actually ultimately determine the strategies and the outcomes. And we can have such a positive impact. We can enhance biodiversity. We can improve people's health and well-being. We can grow a vibrant economic sector. And part of it's connecting people to heritage, part of it's connecting people to nature and their nature on their doorstep. And looking at indicators of environmental change, indicators of environmental quality. There are lots and lots of things we can do here on the doorstep to engage children, to engage educators, to engage the community, and for landowners and others to deliver this. And the Ancholme is uniquely placed to achieve many of these outputs and outcomes. And there are things you can do. You know, bats, for example, are indicators of environmental quality. They are barometers for environmental change. And we can change that. We can enhance them, their habitat in the bigger landscape. But we can also do things just in your back garden. You can put up bat boxes. You can do things. You can get involved in monitoring and recording. So having baseline information, understanding where we are, understanding what's happening. This is someone's garden. I mean, it's just remarkable that you can do that in a small urban green space with very little effort. Absolutely clouds of orchids. Well, why are we not doing that more widely? You can almost hear the pollinating insects buzzing there. This could be the sort of landscape that we have. We're not talking about wall-to-wall water in the Ancholme. We're talking about a softly, softly approach to rewild and re-wet and re-nature some areas, sometimes large, sometimes small, determined by local people. So the Wilder Ancholme project has been working with farmers, landowners and communities to celebrate its past, to encourage a richer future, better adapted to climate change and other challenges. Because at the moment, the valley is very, very vulnerable. Climate is changing, biodiversity is under pressure, and landscapes are threatened by sea level change and inland flooding. So we need to manage this. We need to assess, evaluate, adapt, monitor, review. and then reassess, evaluate, adapt, monitor, review. So we need to manage the change. We need to be able to take a lead on this rather than simply reacting to things that we view as very, very difficult, which are going to happen anyway. So we need to be able to adapt ahead of the change, to predict the change, and to make things easier. And the aim is to build resilience, to manage change, underpinned by effective ways of working. There's some key challenges from the predictions I mentioned earlier. 2080, we expect a 21% decrease in summer rainfall. That was calculated before what happened this year, so it may even be considerably worse than that. But counter to that, a 12% increase in winter rainfall, so expect flooding. And there are issues of seasonal changes versus overall changes. So things may just be the same, but happen in different ways at different times. And all these challenge what we are doing in the landscape, in our day-to-day lives, in the way that we live, and in the way that farmers farm, for example. There are issues of health and lifestyle. There are challenges. We need to allow people and encourage people to take responsibility, to develop community action. We need to grow community champions, growing skills and confidence, taking action, sharing messages and experiences, networking and empowering local people, and showcasing positive actions. So think global and act local. When inevitable changes come, we need to anticipate and adapt rather than wait until being forced to respond. Our project is about working together to bring about improvements and to celebrate the unique farming heritage of the valley, to re-wet and rewild wherever possible, and to reconnect our wild side and work with the grain of nature for a richer, more biodiverse countryside. It's in all our interests. Please have a look at the podcast, the videos, come to the workshops, and also look at things like the virtual flyover that we did from the first phase of the project. There's lots more on the website, and there will be more coming soon. So thank you very much.